What's something you once believed, only to later realize it was propaganda? Story 1. After Iraq invaded Kuwait, a little girl testified before the U.S. Congress. She related being in the Kuwaiti hospital, seeing Iraqi soldiers removing premature babies from incubators and shipping the incubators to Iraq while the babies died on the floor. A few years later, I learned the girl was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S. They lived in New York City the entire time, and there was no way she could have seen what she testified before Congress. She had never even been to her own country. Turns out, the event never happened. It was all just a ruse to motivate Congress to vote for intervention. To this day, that woman is basically a prisoner in her own home. Too many journalists tried to ask her questions in public. Now she is not allowed out in public at all, and her husband refuses all interview requests. Story 2. Not sure it's propaganda, but I used to believe that lemmings occasionally committed mass tragic end. Thanks, Walt Disney, for proving this myth. Story 3. As a native Texan, I was taught that the Texas Revolution happened because of land rights. In reality, it was largely because slavery was illegal in Mexico, and Texas settlers wanted slaves. They don't really talk about that part in school. Answer. Did you also know the Texas Rangers were created to lynch and intimidate Mexicans and indigenous people off their land so white settlers could have it? The group consisted of ranchers, settlers, and later Civil War vets, and they eliminate hundreds to possibly thousands of people over the course of almost 100 years under the guise of law, not to mention all the land that was stolen. Story 4. Personal carbon footprints were created by the oil industry to offload the burden of decarbonization from themselves to consumers. Jaywalking was invented by the auto industry to create a stigma around walking as a mode of transit. Answer. Carbon footprint wasn't invented by the oil industry to offload burden of decarbonization. This is propaganda that people believe. First usage is in 1999 BBC Vegetarian Good Food April 862 to cancel out the damage we do. Morel believes we should plant trees, and that in doing so, an individual or organization can erase their carbon footprint. You'd be surprised, but oil companies don't produce oil that no one uses. Reducing carbon footprint means reducing oil usage among oil other things. Story 5. The war on substances. In New York, you would 15 to life on a nonviolent first offense. No plea deals possible. I grew up rural. Assumed substances turned you into a murderer. City problems. New York opened dozens of prisons in my area. Prison guard is the most common job in my family. If 85 go back to prison, it means it doesn't work. Story 6. As a kid growing up in a North Midwest state, I learned that the Civil War was about states' rights, not slavery. It wasn't until I had a one very assertive high school teacher that I learned what specific rights those states were most concerned about. Answer. It's not even speculation. Their own secession documents list slavery as the main reason. How do you even deny that? Technically, yes, Lincoln did frame the war's goal as preserving the Union, but his private correspondence reveals that he was always anti-slavery. And he did eventually make the war about slavery after a big enough win. It was also a brilliant move because it made Europeans reluctant to support slavery, so they turned away from the Confederacy. Story 7. I would say the propaganda about saturated fat and cholesterol. I grew up thinking foods like margarine and sugary cereals were healthier than an egg. Story 8. That the Gardasil vaccine was going to irrevocably mess up my body as a teen. My mom fully bought into what her church told her about it, and I was lucky to have a doctor broach it with me again as an adult before the cutoff. Story 9. Al Gore wants to eliminate your baby sister in your mommy's tummy. My mom, circa 1996, pregnant with my strong, courageous, and lovely little sister. What a gross, misguided thing to say to a 4-year-old, just because the man was pro-choice. It's one of my first memories, alongside a gnarly storm in the same house. Story 10. That Columbus was a neat guy who came over looking to see what was out there and made friends with the natives. I remember learning this in kindergarten. We drew pictures of our favorite of his 3 ships. Answer. Besides the genocide, it's conveniently omitted that he fudged the numbers in order to make the planet look smaller and stretched Asia about 4,000 miles east. He also threw it was pear-shaped, not the sphere everyone knew it was. The King and Queen of Spain sent his proposal to their experts, who told them to show him the door because his math didn't add up. The royals decided to give it a shot anyway because they were desperate for another route to Asia. Giving him 3 old caravels wasn't that big a deal. Story 11. Growing up in Texas, we were taught that the Texas Revolution was some sort of righteous fight against the evil Mexicans. Turns out things weren't quite that simple, and a large part of the revolution was the desire to keep having slaves. Story 12. I was considering joining the military when I was fresh out of high school. After getting older and talking to people who served, I think 100 of my reasons for wanting to join were just the result of military propaganda. The military will toughen you, teach you confidence and discipline, teach you to be a man. No, time will do those things. Even with no outside influence, you'll have way more self-confidence and agency in your life at 26 than you had at 18, along with all the benefits of that. The military pays well. No, not for what it'll cost you, for sure. Even with no education, you could become a plumber, electrician, garbage man, or police officer, and put yourself on a path to making way more money with less stress, and you can quit if you decide you don't like it, or you have an abusive coworker. Chicks dig guys in uniform. Gold diggers dig guys in uniform. Chicks dig guys who still have both their legs and won't beat the shoot out of her at 2 a.m. because he had a PTSD episode. You'll get to travel the world. You'll either be stuck in a base in Alabama slowly getting lung cancer from diesel fumes, or stuck in a base in Kuwait slowly getting lung cancer from diesel fumes. Save up and do a road trip to Florida or California instead. You'll be able to serve your country. The current public stance of the United States federal government is that Jeffrey Epstein didn't traffic anyone. I could do a lot more for my country by engaging in local mutual aid and social activist groups, or running for a position on a local school board. Answer. Counter-argument. For a lot of people, joining the military is one of the best options to learn confidence and responsibility. For people coming from a bad place with no good role models, the military represents one of the only options. For these same folks, it may be the best pay they could expect. It's not good pay, but it's higher than a lot of what they might have available to them, and comes with free room and board. I've known some responsible women who enjoy the look of a uniform, but to be fair, you can buy a uniform online to wear in the bedroom. Anyway, for most people, the military is a terrible option, outside of maybe being an officer. For some people, it's the best out of a terrible set of options. I never served but came to similar conclusions, seeing friends dealing with severe PTSD. And, given the recent speech from top leadership, it sounds like they're pushing to make it an even more toxic environment. Yay. Story 13. As a child of the 80s, what the hell wasn't I told that wasn't propaganda? I mean, certainly in school. The number of times you find out teachers oversimplified things or flat out lied because it was inconvenient was astounding. Everything from America's founding forward was pretty much lies, or dramatic coverage of the darker truths. Story 14. News reporters. I once gave an interview to a journalist about a topic I was representing. The published article shared almost nothing in common with what I actually said. They wrote the article they wanted and picked a couple quotes from what I said to make it sound like I was saying what they wanted said. That's when I realized nothing I read in the news was true. Answer. Here, I'll make you quit the news entirely. Knowles' law of media accuracy. This adage states that everything you read in the newspapers is absolutely true, except for the rare story of which you happen to have firsthand knowledge. It highlights that when people encounter an error in a story they know personally, they tend to forget that instance and continue to trust the media's accuracy on topics they know less about. The Gell-Mann amnesia effect. Coined by novelist Michael Crichton, this effect describes the phenomenon of an expert noticing errors in a news story on their field of expertise, but then uncritically trusting the accuracy of the rest of the publication. Story 15. Republicans are better with the economy. They are factually not better. Their goal is to make the rich more rich. That's pretty much it. Even Trump is on record saying the Democrats are better with the economy. Answer. This one makes sense when you look at how long it takes laws to go into effect. My own parents before the last election said our tax returns are always higher under a Republican. They live in a mobile home. But the most recent round of Republican tax laws were slated to take effect years after they lost the election. And therefore, the other party gets credit or blame when the person who is affected never watched Schoolhouse Rock. Story 16. That reduce, reuse, recycle was how we'd save the planet. We need real, intense legislation that prioritizes the environment, not fluffy sayings and greenwashing, smoke-blowing consumer voter blaming. Story 17. American dream, work hard and you will have a house and car. LOLOL, such absolute shoot. Hard work makes your boss richer, not you. You can work 3 jobs and not have enough for rent. Story 18. Go Ask Alice, a book allegedly made of a diary of an anonymous girl who was addicted to substances, published by her parents post-mortem. Except that wasn't true. It is alleged it as a push to get teens to accept an anti-substances message from a more peer source instead of an adult. I mean, it worked on me as a teenager, LOL. I remember how it resonated with me. Now it is listed under fiction. Story 19. The civil rights movement solved racism in America. Good Lord, my public school education was bullshit in some respects. Story 20. DARE was an attempt to reduce kids from getting into substances. Turns out, just one power-tripping LA detective wanted to spy on families in schools, so he forced DARE. Story 21. That raw milk was healthy. I was never a crunchy mom type, but for some reason I was an absolute dolt about it. I bought it from a respectable Amish family, but still. Once I saw the actual science and truth about why it's dangerous, I was like, oopsie, how embarrassing. Story 22. That different zones of the tongue corresponds to different sensations. Sweet, sour, spicy, etc. This was taught in middle school, and I tested it out myself with a candy warhead during lunch. I felt like an idiot for believing it, even just for a few hours. I have no idea who convinced every school to teach this like it was real. It flew in the face of common sense. Story 23. Obama was a socialist, and his election was the end of America as a free society. I can testify firsthand that right-wing agitprop fudge you up. Story 24. I believed that possum eat their weight in ticks every week. Only true if the only food source available is ticks. PETA propaganda. Still love possum, but harder to convince other people who know the truth. Edit. Fix typos. Story 25. I believed in the crypto industry, only to realize later on that it was all just bullshit American marketing and scams. Story 26. I am from the South. I grew up believing in benevolent masters, that the North was unnecessarily aggressive and unreasonable, and that life was better for everyone, both black and white, before the Civil War. Any problems that the South has in the modern era is a direct result of Northern interference during and after the war. I took an African American history class in college and had a few existential crises, many crying jags, and the beginning of my deep distrust of the history I was taught in K-12. Story 27. Until I was like 12, I genuinely believed that America was the only country in the world that gave its citizens human rights. I thought literally the entire rest of the world was heavily authoritarian hellscape, partly learned from Christian school. Story 28. The got milk and how it helps make stronger bones. Turned it out they just had a surplus of dairy milk and were looking for the best way to pawn it off on customers. Answer. This. I watched a documentary, forgot the title, that went in-depth into the corruption involved with the Dairy Council and how they line politicians' pockets every year and get to keep spreading BS about milk being some kind of superfood that'll make your bones unbreakable. Making up facts about how cheese makes you live longer. Fudge those got milk ads. Of course I bought into them as a kid and drank tons of dairy milk, thinking I'd become a superhero and instead spent all my time on the toilet because I'm lactose intolerant. Story 29. The United States is special. I'll leave it at that so I don't get carried away. Dad was in the service and we were raised on base, hyper-patriotic. Pledge of allegiance at home, attendance at flag ceremonies, all of it. And I'm ashamed to admit that I raised my kids similarly. I'm sure I was every bit of 30 before I understood that our rights, our way of life, our freedoms exist in plenty of other places, and that many countries far surpass us in several quality of life categories. Also, Christianity, specifically Christian nationalism. Story 30. Politicians spew propaganda, or, alternatively speaking, rhetoric. I learned this from Plato writings. Story 31. Police's job is to protect and serve. False. The oaths they take are not contracts. Their only required job is to uphold the law. Story 32. That hard work alone guarantees success. Turns out, it's just capitalism's bedtime story for adults. Effort matters, sure, but luck and timing own most of the script. Story 33. As someone raised Republican and Christian, my beliefs as a child teenager were almost entirely propaganda. Story 34. Propaganda marketing. Propaganda marketing psychology are all different sides of the same coin. So if you want to realize what's propaganda, everything. We are absolutely swimming in propaganda. Look around you. How many ads, taglines, headlines, and logos do you see? How many are you wearing? You listen to it on your radio, watch it on your screens, see it on posters, stickers, etc. Everything is a commercial. The truth is framed. Story 35. That religion is good. There's still too many people that don't realize it's just another method of control. Story 36. Drain the swamp. He did, of everyone with a brain. Now, after burning so many people, even the dumb people he hired to use, we're left with the bottom of the barrel. Story 37. That the U.S. had the interests of other countries in mind, that U.S. geopolitics was about anything other than capitalism exerting global hegemonic dominance. Story 38. Ronnie said that a rising tide would lift all boats. I still can't afford a boat, and the only thing that's trickled down has been warm and stinky. Story 39. That lawsuit, such as the woman who was severely burned due to hot McDonald's coffee, were frivolous money grabs. Story 40. That all Americans are evil and want to harm my country, Cuba. When I was still a student, we were always reminded how horrible the American people were. I grew up believing this because at that time, only prestigious doctors, people in high government positions, and some military personnel had access to the internet for private use, albeit with restrictions. With the widespread arrival of the internet in the country, I've realized that the vast majority of Americans I've talked to are cool. I even have a friend who lives in Chicago, and once a week we meet on a website called Jiggy to put together puzzles. Story 41. Breakfast is most important meal of the day, which turns out to be one of many successes of marketing propaganda. Story 42. The U.S. are the good guys. You'd rather have them be the global superpower than the other guy, and consequently, almost everything the U.S. news says about other countries. Story 43. I've never thought that actual vaccination was bad, but I used to fall for the mercury and other bad things in the vaccines. I always gave my kids all the vaccines, but I would ask if there was any bad stuff in them first. Story 44. Those videos that show Chinese rural life, where people make things from scratch by growing them and crafting items like silk, ink, and food. A lot of it is just Chinese communist propaganda showing that the farmers in China are not in poverty, and they have an abundance of resources and are not losing their property to development. Story 45. That the top of the pop charts were created by how popular pop music acts were. I later learned there is no voting or ranking system. The artists ranked highly are just owned by the companies that create the artificial ranking charts. It's just a company telling you their products are the best products. Story 46. I genuinely believed in that UN post-war never again crap as a preteen, and that everyone had learned lessons from WW2 Nazi Germany and was so appalled. Lol. Gosh. Story 47. That when I got to high school, people would be offering me substances or trying to peer pressure me into taking substances. Story 48. That the United States was the shining example of freedom, justice, and mercy, a protector of the weak and a model for the world. Story 49. Growing up in the Bible Belt and being a conservative Christian was the right choice and only way. Why do people take the Bible as fact, but then turn around and say it's open to interpretation when it reads like a Harry Potter book? Raising the dead? Check. All animals in the world fitting on a boat? Check. Walking on water? Absolutely. Turning water into wine? Why not? Heavens and earth created in 7 days? Duh. David and Goliath? True story. That the Confederate flag was part of our heritage and not blatant racism. I started thinking independently, and more questions kept coming up, and I couldn't get a satisfactory explanation. Like who in my lineage is linked to fighting for the Confederacy that I need to adopt this as my heritage? I never got an answer for that because it was just an excuse to keep around a symbol of dislike. Living in the South is a mind fudge sometimes. Story 50. You need copious amounts of dairy or your bones will crumble into dust. The Got Milk campaign was huge in the 90s and was paid for by the dairy lobby. Story 51. States' rights. Leaving out the part where the state right the proponents wanted was to own other people, then, and to discriminate, now. X. Story 52. That the internet was going to revolutionize our world and make it better in every way. The first part, absolutely true. The second part, debatable, to say the least. Story 53. Carbon footprint and its importance. The purpose of the concept is to distract attention from the reality that climate change is a systemic problem, closely tied to the nature of our economic system. Only those who have the power to change society's systems can actually affect it, i.e. governments and large corporations. The concept was created by BP. In simpler terms, what good is telling people to take the bus more often and to ride a bike to work when you don't also tell them to pressure their government to invest in public transport and cycle lanes? The bus needs to be there and to be convenient first and foremost. Then comes the matter of people catching it instead of driving a car. Story 54. That Columbus discovered America and that the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean were passive. He was lost, left his crew to starve, and never set foot on the United States. The Europeans who attempted to settle the Caribbean were attacked by the indigenous population time and time again for the next 200 years. Story 55. Recycling is a lie. It's always been about money. The only products that can actually be recycled and reusable are paper, glass, and aluminum metals. Plastic is not available to be recycled thoroughly, and the process is terrible for the environment. Not only that, nobody wants to take on this trash and make inferior products. Third world countries now don't take it, so very little plastic actually gets recycled. Story 56. That Gordon Brown was bad for the economy. I believed all the shoot Cameron said about him, and even voted conservative at my first election in 2015. Never again. Story 57. The moral sanctity of U.S. international presence relations. Started really clocking it in 6th, 7th grade, about 03-04. Going abroad in 05 also made me way more perceptive to international lifestyles too. Nice opening shift overall. Story 58. Growing up in the 80s, it would be that America was a real country that other countries should be like, as they were the best country in the world. Turns out that it's really just 53rd world countries in a trench coat. Story 59. That getting a degree would automatically lead to financial stability. Now I have $37K in proof that says otherwise. Story 60. That watering your lawn is going to make a difference in water use. We are all made guilty to take short showers and use water sparingly when corporations use millions and millions of gallons of water without restriction. Story 61. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and that not supporting Israel is anti-Semitic. Turns out the breakfast thing is just good marketing, and the Israeli-Palestine conflict is way more nuanced than being able to dismiss any of it as being anti-Semitism. Story 62. I think that the American judicial system can offer a citizen a fair trial is the myth that makes me the most sad. Jury nullification forever and everything all the time. Story 63. 9 out of 10 crimes are prevented by the presence of a gun. U.S. crime rates are exacerbated by the presence of a gun. Story 64. That Israel's neighbors all dislike it for no reason, or for purely religious reasons, was quite the shock to find out how wrong I was later on, when I actually learned the history of the region and what a settler colonial state was. That's when I realized that the population of this country is way more heavily propagandized than I thought. Story 65. Police. They are not to be trusted. They have too much power and too little accountability. Punishment, when actually given, are so minor that they might as well be non-existent. Bad cops are often protected and allowed to operate. Story 66. That attractive women with no panties on get stuck in dryers, dishwashers, and under coffee tables a lot. Story 67. Propaganda. I'm still unlearning. I have to have everything in order to be good at something, or just enough of a person. Story 68. Saddam Hussein having WMDs, which led to the invasion of Iraq. Not that I fully believed it. America was so adamant he had them. It almost seemed like THRY gave them to him. The fact 12 years later the UN was like, okay, maybe they did lie. Then leave it at that was strange. Though really invasions of Middle Eastern countries were based on lies anyway, to depose dictators. Libya's gold magically growing legs and disappearing. Afghanistan being led by the former enemy. And now Syria being ruled by a totally, I swear to God I'm not a terrorist anymore. Terrorist, don't help the case. Story 69. There's a Mr. Rogers episode from the 70s or early 80s when he goes to a donut factory. He's offered a donut to which he says no to watch his weight. The donut guy tells him that's there actually no fat in donuts, so they can't make you fat, and Mr. Rogers takes one. I'm pretty certain that the effect of sugar on fat storage was already understood at the time by those in the food industry. I'm confident Mr. Rogers did not know, or else he never would have gone along with that. I'm angry they used Mr. Rogers' naivety to harm children. Story 70. Maybe nice things. 90% people only buy the cheapest shoot. 80 don't tip. I lived in a fake world till I started working retail back in the day and saw the real consumer trends. That other jar of Rouse on the shelf might be the same one when you come back 4 days later, and they might have gone through 300 ragus and 500 great values. The Rouse is there to get people like you in the store and nothing more. They don't have to carry it. Its main purpose isn't even to be sold. It's to create the illusion of better deals for the others because they cost less. Higher profit margin, though. Story 71. That the government was there to help make the world a better place. That the cops were there to help. Story 72. That the reason we don't have male birth control medications is because of misogyny. It's still crappy we don't have them, but the reason, in the US at least, that none of the developed forms of male prophylactic medicine has become available is due to the requirements that the FDA has for all substances, which is that the substances cannot cause any side effects worse than the physical benefit they cause to the patient, which is very problematic because there is absolutely no physical benefit for male birth control pill shots to the patient. All of the physical benefit is to the woman he is having intimacy with. The FDA does not take economic or life quality benefits into account, only physical. And since even placebos cause side effects, let alone medications that affect the reproductive and hormonal systems, there's no way for such a substances to be approved as the rules currently stand. Story 73. That America is the greatest country in the world, and the reasons others dislike us is because they dislike our freedoms. Story 74. I was born in East Germany, former DDR, occupied by Russians. My dad went to the army and told us a lot about it. So basically everything I learned about the West, the free world, was propaganda. We had to fear it. The Americans who represented the free world were our enemy. Story 75. That politicians claiming they cared about the constituents and doing what is best for them, they proved that they do what is best for their bank accounts, only at the expense of ours. Story 76. My childhood was filled with conservative and Catholic propaganda. There wasn't much that didn't have a dislike, selfish subtext. Story 77. The United States is a good, safe, societally equitable, and financially beneficial country to live in that has always been the good guys in times of war and even helped out other countries. MFW, I would have died due to doctors no longer trying to help me because it didn't seem serious if my mom didn't weaponize her autism against the stock market and treat it like a full-time job. Story 78. Not all Republicans ate bad people. Edit. Lol typo. Meant are, not ate. Totally different meaning. Lamau. Story 79. That adults knew what they were doing. Turns out they are just taller kids with better passwords, Googling everything like the rest of us. Story 80. Nuclear energy generation was dangerous. Compared to all other forms, it's much safer, much more efficient, and has far less environmental impact. Story 81. Milk is vital to growth. Got Milk ads were propaganda during the 90s to increase dwindling dairy sales. Story 82. I used to believe Dave Berg from Mad Magazine was wise or something, even though he used to do the lighter side of section of Mad, which was always by far the least funny bit. I thought he was wise, but it was just Likudnik propaganda. Because of him, I used to proudly call myself a Zionist when I was a kid. Story 83. That the stock market is based on sell and trade of the people. Nope. Manipulation to the fullest extent. I also believe short selling was illegal. Well, it is, but even the Fed overlooks it. It runs rampant. Story 84. That conservatives are better at managing the economy. Once I was older to understand how things worked, do my own research and check actual facts, I realized it's far from the truth. Story 85. That the southern states seceded over states' rights. Turns out, just because you lose a war doesn't mean you have to stop producing propaganda. Story 86. I'm still not 100% sure what happened, but I have come to understand that MSG is just a harmless flavoring spice with an unfortunate moniker that was demonized by doctors in a racist move towards Asians. Thai restaurants in my small town growing up had no MSG on every page of their menu. My stepmom's dad was an old weirdo chiropractor who would only go to the no MSG restaurant. He was a controlling jerk. The truth really clicked into place for me when I read about it. Story 87. Most news about North Korea. The majority of news articles that makes us think it's a crazy, insane country end up being heavily exaggerated or redacted for inaccuracy, not to mention the articles that come from Pentagon and CIA-funded NGOs. The Unicorn Cave story? Turned out it was an archaeological find of cave paintings of an ancient emperor riding unicorns. They didn't actually claim to find a cave of unicorns. The jeans are banned story? Redacted because it's easily disproven. The story he fed his brother to dogs? Redacted because his brother was seen a few months later at a public event. Even the defector stories don't add up when you cross-reference their own stories, and many probably make them up because it's one of the few ways a North Korean can earn a living in the South. Also, they legally can't say anything positive about North Korea in the South because it's against the law there. I'm definitely not saying it's a paradise, but most of what we are led to believe about them is clearly not true or wildly exaggerated. Story 88. That trying green stuff even once would inevitably lead to an addiction to hard substances. Turns out I only really enjoy pot. I rarely drink, and the only times I tried harder stuff was because I was curious about what else I'd been lied to about. I've been prescribed all sorts of addictive medications at different points in my life. Adderall, Xanax, pain meds, and haven't ever abused any of them. That's not to say these substances aren't dangerous, but more so that trying pot doesn't mean you're automatically going to turn into an addict or be interested in other substances. Story 89. I remember an economics teacher in high school saying that greed is good, as in it leads to opportunity and success. Man, was that a fudge lie. Story 90. The reason behind freeing the slaves was out of respect for the enslaved. In reality, it was done only to bankrupt the South so they couldn't afford to win the war. Story 91. I followed a bunch of right-wing blogs in 2004. Just constant talking point stuff. John Kerry Swiftboat, Iraq WMD, etc. I thought they were all like me and my friends, just blogging and commenting on each other's blogs before social media took off. Right after the election, a bunch of blogs just stopped posting. One of the bloggers actually used his blog to ask around if anyone knew of any writing blogging jobs because his just ended. Story 92. That Israel always existed and was America's greatest ally and could never be hurt by outside forces because God says so. Was literally taught this in church as a child. Story 93. That carrots make your eyesight in the dark better. Didn't realize it was British propaganda to cover up their invention of radar. Story 94. Interesting. I don't even know if I'm even legal to say this. I'm Vietnamese, and I've been to Ha El prison, Maison Centrale, a few times when I was a kid. It was built during the French colonization era to capture Vietnamese activists who fought for independence. Back then, I saw it as pure evil. The stories, the school books, everything made the French look like monsters, and the Vietnamese activists as heroes. They still act like it was one of the greatest crimes the French ever committed. But when I visited again as an adult, I realized it's really just about who rules and who's got power. Because if you do the same thing today, speak and act against the government or the Communist Party, you'll be branded a traitor and end up in prison too. History isn't written by the good guys. It's written by whoever's in charge. Story 95. One I learned from horrible histories, noting how the original meaning got twisted, then later learned it was likely a myth. There's this King Canute of England, or what amounts to England. He's eventually becomes the king of Denmark and Norway, massive empire that dominates the North Sea. One story about him has it be said he sat in front of the sea and ordered it not to go over his ankles, but it does anyway. Some people think it's him believing he had the power to command the sea itself to not wash over his feet, and he gets mocked for it. However, what's left out is that after this happens, he takes off his crown and declares it a sign of how meaningless the power of kings are compared to God. However, it's highly possible the whole story is just propaganda to make him look good. So it's a propaganda backfire that's been alive for centuries. Story 96. Big poster had me convinced there was a horse or sailboat in that picture. But after standing there for an hour looking at it, I realized the guy in Mallrats was right. There is no horse. There is no sailboat. There is only headache. Big poster and Advil are in cahoots. Story 97. In high school, I was a member of Catholic Youth Organization, and we were recruited by our diocese to lobby against abortion, which the Supreme Court had recently legalized in 1973. In our training, I innocently asked, what about victims of violation who become pregnant? The trainer said that because violation was traumatic, it was impossible for the female to become pregnant. I believed this several years until my wife spit out her drink when told her the story. Story 98. That public school is all substances, gangs, and guns, and that homeschooling is the only way to go. That CPS will ask tricky questions just so they can steal us from our parents. Or that homeschooling is free of all abuse. Turns out that my family was abusive, and many other families too. Turns out public school would have actually helped. Oops. Story 99. That the war in Iraq was about weapons of mass destruction. America just wanted to install someone more American-friendly. Add it to the list. Story 100. The whole Quetzalcoatl bit American education spews. I never bothered to fact-check, since it was taught in like second grade, so why would school lie to? Echoed the information in a college course on the history of Europe since 1865. One of the most shameful moments of my life. Story 101. In college, the Ukrainian government collapsed, and for a time, there were Banderovci Nazi gangs who worshipped Bandera, were prominent in politics and targeting people on the streets. Russian propaganda was that these Nazis overthrew the government and that Ukraine was now controlled by Nazis. In reality, the Ukrainian people were sick of rigged elections and overthrew the government. The Nazis did try and get into politics and were all over for about 2 months, but when they held elections, basically no one voted for the Nazis. They didn't take power. Russia just wanted an excuse to attack. Story 102. Morning in America by Ronald Reagan. I voted for him, then I realized his war on substances was a propaganda scam. Story 103. Flags everywhere is normal. My local Walmart at one point had 28 American flags hanging from the rafters and walls throughout the store. One day I realized how weird I would think it was if they were any other flag. Or how if a French or Irish person walked into a business and saw that many flags, they'd think they forgot it was Bastille or St. Patrick's Day, or their country had just started up a new fascist regime overnight and was really leaning on patriotism. Story 104. I thought the FLQ did a bunch of bombings and were mad terrorists. Then I learned a member of the RCMP was caught after he blew himself up with his own bomb, which he was going to blame on Quebec separatists. That led to an investigation which revealed there was a well-organized Black Flag campaign against Quebec separatists by the RCMP, likely with the personal approval of Canada's Prime Minister. Though the FLQ undoubtedly bombed things, the actual members took responsibility for bombing symbolic things like statues and trying to avoid casualties. So I'm always wondering if the ones that eliminate a bunch of people were done by someone else, specifically our own government. Story 105. That the heir to Hormel was gay and had been appointed as the U.S. ambassador to a country which was Catholic and would not allow two men to cohabitate in the embassy. Story 106. The U.S. military destroyed the beautiful historic cities in Syria. Tulsi Gabbard used to go on these fringe podcasts I liked. It turns out she's a Russian asset. Story 107. That the concept of only child syndrome in the 90s was a product of declining birth rate in the U.S. Story 108. That the Iraq was started on false pretenses and that it was a bad thing. Most people still believe this, but it's really not supported by any evidence. Story 109. That climate change was fake and also that it was driven entirely by how many clouds were in the sky, not human endeavors. Of course, 16-year-old me didn't care that the two views were mutually incompatible because I was being a good little Republican. The shoot part is that I indoctrinated myself because I noticed it decreased the number of violent beatings I got. Unlearning the propaganda was fun. Story 110. That Social Security is going to go bankrupt and we're not going to get back any of the money we paid in. Story 111. McDonald's coffee lawsuit. That woman was seriously hurt, and I dislike that I ever believed otherwise. Story 112. God, I guess. I don't consider it as propaganda, but I did think there was something to the ancient aliens theory for a while, but not anymore. Story 113. Most of the independence wars of the Americas are taught with lies and bullshit nationalism narrative. Story 114. I was really young and not out of the church yet, like 12, 13 years old. I was an anti-masker and believed that people who got COVID were being dramatic and that it was just like the flu. Fast forward, I lost my teen years to long COVID. I have POTS and MECFS now. I guess it's karma. I have to remind myself from time to time that I didn't deserve this because of what I believed at the time, and that I couldn't have known any better at the age I was. Anti-mask Christian stuff was all I ever heard at that age, and the churches I went to were pretty conservative. I just find it ironic that 12-year-old me gets a taste of just a flu down the line. I was out of that belief and taking proper precautions by the time I got COVID, but I still blame myself, even if I know I couldn't have known better after being indoctrinated. Story 115. For way too long, I believed that the reason Cuban cigars weren't sold in the U.S. was because they were laced with green stuff. Story 116. Knives were scary weapons and a big no-no. They're going to take your guns. Turns out it was a bunch of school teacher propaganda that was based on fear and poor information for the former, and a lot of fear-based crap for the latter. Also, the 2 bombings of Japan. Story 117. The Bible. Until I actually read most of it. It's not even good propaganda. Makes you wonder how they kept the ball rolling after widespread literacy and translations. Story 118. As an American Jew, I know I'm not alone in believing Israeli propaganda. I went on Birthright in 2017 and had a positive experience. The tour guide spouted all the propaganda you'd expect, but at least on a kibbutz in Golan Heights, had a local well-known musician as an ambassador, and he said some real fudge shoot about Palestine, and proud of my tripmates for calling him out. So bad he got banned from being able to work with Birthright in the future. Anyways, not proud it took until last year for me to fully wake up about what's happening, instead of just wanting peace and cohabitation. Free Palestine all day, baby. Fudge Israel. Story 119. The constructs of society and the striving for achievement, hustle and grind. We are all in a matrix and most aren't aware. Sporley. Story 120. That the apostate Paul was actually an apostle, and that all the sexist orders he gave were justified by his apostlehood. Turned out I had just let people lie to me and pressure me. Acts 1 lays are the requirements to be an apostle, and lists all 12 by name. Story 121. That Christopher Columbus watched a bug crawl on the surface of an orange, and had the idea that the world was round. Answer. The issue was never that people believed that the earth was flat. It was that, with the sailing technology of the time, one could not sail the entire distance from Europe to China without making landfall for resupplies. At best, the needed supplies for such a long voyage would take up so much weight that there would be no room for enough revenue-generating cargo to pay for the voyage. And the reason why his crew threatened to mutiny had nothing to do with falling off of the earth or the horrors of unknown regions. It was because they were nearing the point of no return on their supplies. Within 2 weeks, they would not have enough fresh water, etc., remaining to last them until they could get back to a known friendly port. Story 122. I used to like Yeonmi Park because I was interested in understanding more about what happens inside North Korea. Turns out she's being paid by the U.S. government to make up lies that have since been proven untrue. And there's a whole industry around it in South Korea, too. Wild stuff. Story 123. That the atom was indivisible. The fact I was in school, in 2010, being taught this bullshit in basic science class, is a testament to the absolute stupidity and failure of our education system. We split the atom more than 50 years before I was born, and my own teachers didn't understand. Shoot. Answer. Actually, that expresses something technically correct but worded extremely poorly. The atom is the smallest part that can be considered as being the element it can be claimed to be. Once you split it, it completely nullifies any claim to definition. For example, one of the nuclear fission reactions uses a neutron to destabilize U-235 to split into Kr-92 and Ba-141. In the act of inducing nuclear fission, you lose the uranium. Story 124. That we are free, free to go into debt and work, or be threatened now with arrest or takedown. Brian Kilmeade. We were never free. Debt and inflation kept us on the hamster wheel. The Western propaganda is so good that we go to work every day, consume the content they prescribe to us, get trapped in the red versus blue fight, give our productivity to billionaires, and still rationalize our freedom. Story 125. I actually did believe that toilets flush the other way on the other side of the equator. But what is this propaganda for? I know it's propaganda, but propaganda for what? Who benefits from it? Story 126. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Started as a cereal marketing campaign in the late 1800s. Carrots improve eyesight, especially at night. British World War II propaganda campaign to deflect attention away from their use of radar to detect enemy aircraft. Story 127. That the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but about states' right in general. Growing up in Georgia, that was definitely a talking point. Story 128. The propaganda that Muslims did 911. I don't know how I found out about the dancing Israelis so late, but there were literally a group of Mossad agents watching the Twin Towers with binoculars and dancing when the buildings hit. So many Muslims were persecuted after that event. Story 129. Learning the entire history of the Americas from a Eurocentric colonial revisionist perspective in U.S. public education. Story 130. Audie Murphy, the WW2 hero, was used by the government to sell the war and inspire others to throw themselves into danger. It makes me wonder if his stories were real or just exaggerated. After serving in the Army myself and seeing people get awards they did not earn, like Purple Hearts for claiming a headache after a mortar hit the base, it is hard not to see most of it as bullshit. Story 131. Little House on the Prairie was a series I loved. Then I grew up and realized that the series offers embroidered fictions to cover some harsh, ugly facts, and that the series props up racist mythology about the West. Story 132. China is bad. They are all poor and have no rights. Seeing how they nail houses in the middle of a newly built highway and aren't forced to move, they probably have some more rights than us. Story 133. That Kennedy was assassinated for no reason. Turns out he was doing some sketchy stuff with the CIA, sneaking and flying over into Cuba and almost turning things into a world war. Story 134. The way that policed our speech in school. First Amendment, Mrs. Small. I can say what I want and will. Story 135. Basically any variant of tax the rich more. The moment of realization was when I realized that Occupy Wall Street took me for a ride. I definitely had gotten angry as a freshly minted young adult subjected to that rhetoric would be, and I realized much later I was just a useful fool. The nail in the coffin was actually paying taxes and doing tax returns as a functioning adult, talking with finance professionals like bankers and accountants. It doesn't take a degree in financial rocket science to see that the rich are taxed to all the way to cloud nine already, that there are loopholes in the tax code because no one likes paying taxes. And I, as a middle-class citizen, can and do use the very same loopholes the upper and lower classes do. Never again. Tax the rich. We are the 99, and similar propaganda thereof can all die in a fire. They only provoke anger that produces nothing of worthwhile value for the commons. Story 136. Every single thing I learned about Islam growing up was completely mischaracterized to demonize Muslims as barbaric. The more I learn about the faith, the more I realize there is a long-standing campaign for us to misunderstand them because their justice, morality, and clarity actually outperforms the other Abrahamic religions.